Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All right. In the name of God, most merciful, most gracious, praise and blessings be upon our prophets, Muhammad and Jesus and Moses and Abraham, and all of those who have carried this message in the past, in the present, and in the future. I want to talk a little bit about American democracy and about Islam in America. Because today we're here to talk about an American Muslim legacy, and it is nearly impossible to talk about that without asking ourselves, what is it that these two approaches to life command of us? Because we live in a moment right now where we're told that it's actually impossible to be both. That one cannot sustain an American identity and an Islamic identity at the same time. That if you believe in a certain set of principles by your faith, that you cannot also be American. Now, in 1776, I need you guys to listen now. 1776, we're talking about things that matter. In 1776, when this country declared independence, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the words that would make this country the country that we know and we love and we inhabit, he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. And when the Constitution was ratified, it was ratified under a preamble. And I'm sure some of the civics students here would be able to tell it better than me, but it was ratified under a preamble that says, we, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, about 1,200 years earlier, a prophet came with a message, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And his message can be summarized in a number of ways. But I want to summarize it like this. وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَيُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. And let there rise from amongst you a community who enjoins in good, who opposes evil and wrongdoing, and who believe in God. I want to ask us whether or not these ideals, the ideals of our Constitution, the ideals of our Quran, if these are actually mutually exclusive. Because for both of them, it was about creating a community that did good. And yet we find ourselves in this moment where people have looked at people who play like us, who have the color of our skin, who have names like ours, and say that you cannot actually be American. That this is not the moment where you can inhabit this place, despite the fact that so many of us have been here for generations. I want to tell you quickly about my family, to put this in some personal context. I come from a deeply uncommon, if wholly American family. See, my dad, he immigrated here back in the late 1970s. His father was a vegetable salesman in Alexandria, Egypt. His mother was an illiterate homemaker. They lived on a 4th floor apartment overlooking the fish market where every day my grandfather would sell tomatoes. My father, he used to study by lamplight. There was a lamp right in front of his home. And after he was done with school and after he was done helping my grandfather, he would climb upstairs right next to the chicken coop and study. He knew that if he had an opportunity for a life that was going to be different than the one his father had, that it was going to be because he was able to do it literally by the book. And he made a decision about what opportunities would lie ahead. He studied and he had the opportunity to earn 2 scholarships, to do a PhD. And he was going to do his PhD in mechanical engineering, and he was between 2 places. He was between Bayreuth, Germany, and Detroit, Michigan. Now, the only 2 similarities between Detroit and Bayreuth is that they both have a large automotive industry, And both of them end with the sound Reut. My dad, though, he was the kind of guy who did his homework. After all, that's the way he was able to make it out of Egypt. And when he did his homework, he learned about a country where it did not matter what color his skin was, it did not matter how he prayed, it did not matter what his name was, that he, as Muhammad, could be just as American as a Steve or a Mike. And when he made a decision about where he would go, he decided that he would go to America. He took a bet on a society that was big enough for a Muhammad and big enough for Abdurrahman. And what he found when he came here was that, in fact, he could make it here. It didn't quite matter the fact that his English was kind of broken when he came, that people saw him as just yet another addition to this American fabric, this American mosaic that is more beautiful and grander because all of us contribute to it. In fact, my dad, he was born and raised right in front of a market, and he decided that he would live in a market too. There's a fantastic market in Detroit called the Eastern Market. Anybody ever been to the Eastern Market? All right, fantastic. So my dad moved to the Eastern Market, and in Egypt, one of the delicacies that he really enjoyed, and it might strike home here or not, was he really enjoyed lamb's heads. And in Egypt, to get a lamb's head, that's a big deal because every lamb only has one head. And so if everybody's trying to get the head, that's pretty hard to get. It's just supply and demand. But he found that in America, he could get the lamb's heads for $3. And so he ate like a king. He said, this must be the land of milk and honey and lamb's heads. And so he found himself in a place where he could make the future of our family. And he did. He finished his PhD and he went back to Egypt over the summer. There he met my mother. And they moved back to America, and they realized that they only had two things in common. First, they were two of the only Egyptian people they'd ever met in America. And second, they had conceived a child. But those were the only two things they had in common. So they ended up getting divorced. And my mother, she remarried a gentleman who was working as a translator in the Middle East and moved back to the Middle East. And my father, he remarried a woman from a place called Gratiot County. Now, I know I'm not in Michigan, but in Michigan we do this annoying thing when we try and tell you where things are. So Gratiot County's right here. Her family has been in this territory since before the Revolutionary War, before this was a place called America. And so you have my father Muhammad and my stepmom Jackie building a life together in a wholly American, wholly Muslim, deeply uncommon household. And that's the household I got to grow up in. I want to give you a sense of exactly how diverse that household was. I'll take you to my house on Thanksgiving, all right? So you've got the turkey, you've got the Lions, they're losing on TV, right? And then you've got my family. And you've got Muhammad, my dad, who he's an engineer but also leads Salatul Jum'ah in various masajid in various places across Metro Detroit. He's an imam. And then you've got my grandma Judy, all right? Grandma Judy grew up in Flint. She's a nurse who trained in Flint, and she's also a deacon in her Presbyterian church. I got to live with my grandma Judy while I was a student at the University of Michigan in college. And then you've got the wild card, complete wild card. You've got Uncle Piot, all right? Uncle Piot immigrated from what was then the USSR, what is now Poland, and he's an avowed atheist. So you've got to imagine my household, right? You've got Muhammad, Judy, and Piot talking about all the things everybody talks about on Thanksgiving. The Lions are still losing, and we're now talking about democracy and about God and about religion and about faith. And you know what? These people don't agree. How could they? They come from completely different walks of life. They've always seen the world as different. But I'll tell you, they come together every year because for them, the future that they are building together is one that they are building shared. They have no choice but to build this family together because we are, in fact, a family. And so whether it's me, my brother Osama, my sister Semya, or my cousins Zora and Dara, we all are that manifestation of the shared future that they're building. And they come together for us. So I grew up in a place, in a household, where I got to see all kinds of people. And I realized that I really loved people. I really loved understanding who they were, the challenges that they faced, sometimes the tragedies that they'd experienced. And at the same time, I realized I loved understanding their hopes and their aspirations and the things that help them to believe in a tomorrow that is better than their today. And so I grew up saying, I think I want to be a doctor. I want to take science, which was just the way we talked about the world in my house, and I want to use it to help people. And so I think I want to be a doctor. Now, when I went to college, I went to the University of Michigan. I studied biology and politics, all right? You can imagine my dad, who made it here because he singularly focused on engineering. When I told him, Baba, I think I want to study biology and politics, he just looks at me and says, Abdurrahman, I think you are very confused. But here's the thing. These things are not as different as you might imagine. Because if biology is the system of rules that our bodies use to make scarce decisions about scarce resources inside of us, then politics is the set of rules by which our societies make decisions about scarce resources. And while I was in med school, we spent a lot of time learning about the biology. But if you really want to understand who gets sick and who does not, why certain places are more ill than other places, it usually has a lot more to do with the politics. It has to do with whether or not people have access to a job that's stable, that pays them a living wage, that gives them access to healthy foods and walkable environments and clean air and clean water. The ability to move in the world without being traumatized because of who they are. Those are the things that are going to shape health and disease. And as I learned about that, I realized that my path was really going to be focused on public health. The system around us that creates the means of having a healthy life in the first place. The things that we often forget when we focus singularly on the biology. And so I moved forward in that path. At 30 years old, I was named health commissioner in the city of Detroit. In that role, my job was to rebuild a health department that had been shut down when the city of Detroit was facing bankruptcy. Again, think about societies making decisions about scarce resources. When Detroit was facing bankruptcy, they made the decision to shut down their health department. 185-year-old department, built in 1827, in a city that has a higher infant mortality rate than Mexico. In a city where the likelihood of a child being hospitalized for asthma is triple the rest of the state of Michigan. In a city where 1 in 10 babies are going to be exposed to lead, which is 4 times as high as the national average, they shut down their health department. My role was to rebuild that department. And on one of my first days of work, I got to meet a little boy. And that little boy taught me a lot about both courage and context, right? Courage and context. He was a 3-year-old little boy. He was the 4th child of a 21-year-old mom. He's probably met his father maybe 4 times in his life. And when his mom introduced him to me, he didn't do what most kids do, right? Most kids, when they're introduced to an adult, they hide behind their parent's leg. Or other kids will give you a hand, but they won't really look you in the eye. This boy walked right up to me and gave me a big hug. Face didn't change for a minute, and then went back to his mom. And I thought about his courage in the face of the kinds of challenges he faced as a boy growing up in Detroit. And we realized that the work that we needed to do at the health department was about making sure that we were breaking down the barriers that children like him had to being able to learn and earn, like, alhamdulillah, the children who go to this school have. So we got to work rebuilding that department. We built programs to give kids access to glasses free of charge, delivered at school, so that at least if they were sitting in overcrowded classrooms, they could see the blackboard. We stood up to some of the biggest corporate polluters in our state. When they wanted to raise their emissions of things like sulfur dioxide, we stood up and said, you can't do this here. Because children like him are going to have to breathe that, and that's what lands them in the hospital. And then we heard about the Flint water crisis. And if you don't know what happened in Flint, please do read about it. There was a circumstance where, in order to save a couple dollars, state government made the decision to change the water source for a whole city. Ended up poisoning 9,000 children in one of the poorest, most destitute cities in America. When we heard about the Flint water crisis, we realized that the children in our schools might be exposed to lead in the single place where we systematically concentrate our most vulnerable people, our children, most of the day, most of the year. So we built a protocol to have every single school, daycare, and Head Start tested for lead in the water. We did it in 6 months. That protocol is now model practice per the National Association of City and County Health Officials. But you gotta imagine the situation that I was in. You gotta imagine the situation I was in. I was in a position where I was rebuilding an agency that had been shut down when the state took over the finances in the city of Detroit, while watching as the same state was poisoning the same kinds of kids I was trying to protect in a city just 50 miles north of me. And I asked myself, what's the responsibility here? What is it that I am supposed to do? I'm in a position of technical leadership, but my leadership is bounded, and I cannot solve the problems that I need to solve for kids like him, kids like them in Flint. And I thought about, well, maybe if I ran for office, maybe if I stood up and said, you know what, I think I can do that job better than the individual who's doing it right now. Maybe I could run for office. And now, I want you to think about what went through my mind. I'm 32. I'm brown. And I'm Muslim. And in this country, in this moment, it may seem that that's impossible to be elected. But at the same time, I also realize that I'm a physician, I'm an educator, and I'm a public servant in the context of a state that needs those skills. And so I said, you know what? I think I am going to run for office. I think I am going to run for governor. And so I did. And I'll tell you, we've gone around the state of Michigan. We've been in 26 different counties, 48 different cities, spoken in over 100 different rooms. And I had thought that I would have no shot at being able to win over rooms of people who may never have seen a Muslim before in their life. And then we start talking about issues. And then we start listening, and they listen. And we have conversations about the challenges in our state that are far bigger than what we look like. And so I want to conclude with a couple of points to the young people here. A couple of points to the young people, and I will conclude. I'm getting the paper conclusion remarks, so I'll conclude. Number one, so where are my young people at? Raise your hand. If you're under 18, raise your hand. Oh man, we got no young people in the room. All right. Number one, it is easy for us in this moment to be agents of our own discrimination. It is easy for us in this moment to be agents of our own discrimination. We walk around the world asking ourselves what other people think of us, rather than asking what we think of the world. So do not be an agent of your own discrimination. Do not count yourself out from the fights that matter. I want to go back to how I opened. We talked about the responsibility to fight for justice in Islam and in the entire purpose of our Constitution. That fight for justice requires us to get up off the sidelines. We cannot sit on the sidelines and expect that somehow the world will change when we have the skills to change it and we choose to stay on the sidelines. Number two, this is a moment right now where people are asking questions about what it means to be Muslim in America. What is it that these people contribute to this society? Why is it that we tolerate them here? And we have a choice. We can either stay on the sidelines, assume that the world will just go its way and we won't have to actually show ourselves, or we stand up. And the reason we stand up is not just because it's a moment where we have to fight for our own sense of what we give to this country, but also because we don't have a choice. It's not just our fights that matter right now. Because there are many, many people in this society for whom justice is not given. Whether they be poor and working African American people in places like Detroit or poor and working white people in places like the UP. They require us to stand up for our own set of beliefs and advocate for them. And then lastly, do not assume that you cannot do the things that people tell you you cannot do. Do not assume that you are out of the fight before you even start. This is a moment right now where anything is possible. Anything is possible. And it is only possible when we get up off our sidelines and make it so. And so as you think about what you're going to do in the world, I do hope that you think beyond the kinds of careers that traditionally Muslims fit themselves into. Ask yourself where that fight for justice is and where it ought to take you, and then go there. And for the parents in the room, when your kids tell you, I want to be a filmmaker, or I want to be a historian, or I want to run for office, remember that we are consistently asking, why is it that we're not portrayed well in the media? Why is it that nobody tells our history? Why is it that there's nobody representing us? It's because we are unwilling to allow this talent in this room to do that for us. So we have to stand up and be agents of our and the collective justice. And so bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, as we look at this class and we look at this institution of higher learning, let's remember that the future that we want to build, not only for ourselves as Muslims, but for the collective in this country, it starts with them and their empowerment. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.